Hi, so I'm going to talk today about decolonisation and climate justice. And I intend to talk about it so that we can also discuss it, because it's really important that we actually take back what we learned today and put it into action. So decolonisation and climate justice are evolving movements that recognise and challenge the living legacies of colonialism, including climate change and injustice. These legacies are of infrastructures, as well as ideas, institutions, spaces, and practices that shape our thoughts and interactions in our daily lives. In our daily lives, we need energy, food, fuel, electricity, and billions of us need more of it. This is significant because our energy and the way that we get our energy changes our Earth in ways that are increasingly risking our lives, with disproportionate impact on humans that have done the least to cause these changes and that benefit the least from them. A living legacy of colonialism is that we, although not all of us, can have things that we want for the least possible prices. This is not without human and environmental and ecological impact. For us to discuss decolonisation and climate justice and how we can act locally, we need to talk about colonisation, climate change, and injustice. To talk about colonisation, we have to talk about slavery. To talk about slavery here on this stage is difficult for me. I've studied a lot about the role of Bristol in the Transatlantic Slave Trade, and to be just by the Matthew is quite significant. It's also a privilege for me to be talking about climate justice and decolonisation. Although colonisation can be understood in many different ways, generally, colonisation describes the claiming of land that is inhabited by people. It also explains the processes of control that are systemic of a country, territory, or people. Slavery describes the dehumanizing ownership of people as property. In some form, colonization and slavery have been part of our history for centuries, and it continues to be experienced for people living today. To talk about colonization and slavery, we need to talk about race. Evolving from misguided science, unfortunately, race is a relatively recent idea. It was initially used by colonial powers to divide, control, and exploit the majority of our world's population alongside our resources on Earth. Describing the categorization of human beings into distinct groups based on physical and mental differences that were perceived does not have any biological basis. In other words, it is not true that we have these differences in our DNA as deeply that it makes us not the same species. Idea of race justified the Atlantic slave trade, which is important to the reckoning of the Industrial Revolution and therefore climate change as we experience it today. We do not know all there is to know about the transatlantic slave trade. Beginning in the 15th century, recognized now as a crime against humanity, the Atlantic slave trade was one of the most complex international trades in modern history. Also known as the triangular trade, arms, like guns, textiles, and wine were shipped from Europe to Africa. Slaves from Africa to the Americas, and sugar, spices, cotton, silver, coffee, metals, leather, tobacco, from the Americas to Europe. Approximately 12 to 15 million human beings were trafficked from Africa to the Americas, and around 1.5 million died on the voyage. Sadly, these numbers could be grossly underestimated. Colonizers, including the British state at the time, enslaved black and minority ethnic people. Cities like Bristol have a massive role in that. Merchants that profited, slave traders that profited the most, moved into banking and ultimately helped finance the Industrial Revolution, which is often notified by the development of the steam engine in the 18th century and the first use of a coal-fueled steam engine to power the cotton mill in Britain. The introduction of a steam began a process of what we call development, with fossil fuels at its heart. We've known about the greenhouse gas effect since the 1800s. A physicist even predicted in 1896 that carbon dioxide from coal burning would warm the planet. Yet since 1965, around 3/4 of emissions were produced with companies that were well informed of their effects. As the human species, we are not all equally responsible for the shift to burning fossil fuels in the 19th century, nor the burning of fossil fuels today. We know just 100 companies are responsible for more than 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions over the last 3 decades. Moreover, with over 800 military bases, the US military is the single largest polluter in the world, releasing more carbon in the atmosphere than 140 countries combined. Climate justice and decolonization, hand in hand, to me, concerns questions and ideas. And it requires us to examine our presumptions about our world today and how it is. For me, it's really about questions. Why, in Britain, do we seem to have minimal public knowledge of colonization and slavery? Why is it that for myself, I had to go to university to really understand? Why are racist, sexist, and classist disapproved ideas about overpopulated planet still in public discourse? And why is it that they are expressed by prominent figures that we love, like David Attenborough? Why do we recognize climate change extends beyond borders, yet we do not formally recognize climate refugees? How is it that in Britain, money was granted by Parliament to compensate slave owners, yet reparations are still being called for and are largely unheard? How do we teach, learn, and share our understanding of our history? And how do we do so whilst acknowledging that we do not know all there is to know? How do we amplify the experiences, concerns, and ideas of humans most affected by climate change at this very point in time? When will we acknowledge that our public spaces are increasingly less accessible for all? And what are we going to do about it? Who should be heard that isn't being heard today? Today's map of climate change hotspots mirrors almost exactly our maps of colonization and slavery, and this is not a coincidence. To speak about climate justice is to recognize our interdependency, as well that our actions are not without consequence. To me, to speak of justice, I think, is to talk about power, it's to talk about direct democracy, and it's to talk about what we can do. So, how can we decolonize? And how can we achieve climate justice? How can we think differently about our spaces? How can we challenge what we already know? How can we learn from each other? How can we ensure that we are all being heard? These questions are really important if we are to change and act on climate change. Thank you.
Woo!